Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be listening to the 12th part of What If Deku Was in Villain Class 1A. If you enjoy, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing down below, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you get notified when videos go live. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Chapter 27, What Did I Do? Shinso had really been looking forwards to the term break. A week free of lessons and his classmates. Well, his lessons he didn't mind much, to be honest. Some part of him quite enjoyed them. Yes, he wasn't the best, could barely be compared to the model students that surrounded him. Regardless, they were a distraction, something to focus on and apply himself to. If he could focus on those lessons, get what he needed to know into his head, then maybe, just maybe, he could get where he wanted to go. Shinso had a few options in mind. Firstly, he attempted the easy route, direct entry into UA's Class 1B, which obviously failed. He'd expected this, which is why he also applied for Class 1C, General Studies. He didn't actually think he'd get in, but by some miracle, he scraped through. He survived the first term and did his best in the sports festival. The entire event was practically run by the villain Class 1A, and for some reason they allowed him to do what he wanted and prove himself. If it were enough, the principal would offer him a chance to transfer to the hero course come next year. If that didn't work, Shinso knew there must be other hero schools out there who would eagerly take up a UA alumni with a promising sports festival debut, right? But although all this looked promising, there was one major problem with associating himself with UA. He'd towed the line of Class 1A before. He knew he had. His school had warned his parents that they'd sent a letter of recommendation to UA. After holding his breath for a few months, he received an automatic email response saying that Class 1A was filled with more needy applicants and they didn't feel as though Shinso's case was too dire. It was an utter relief. Attending Class 1A was an extremely risky move. Even if you graduate, the participation will sit on your permanent record, and was bound to bring up some problems in the future, even if you did manage to do well. Sure, UA boasted some star students, but everyone knew they were few and far between, and even they faced struggles from the ghosts of their pasts. Getting into Class 1C meant that Shinso was still on UA's radar, and they definitely knew about his previous, unwilling application to Class 1A. It was rare that new students were moved into the villain class after the beginning of the year, because it could mess with the delicate system and dynamic. However, it certainly wasn't unheard of. And when Shinso overheard some of his classmates talk to Present Mike, their homeroom teacher, about Shinso possibly transferring to Class 1A, he knew he was in trouble. What had he done, then? Well, it all started when they found out about his quirk. At the beginning of term, Shinso was very quiet. He supposed it was a learned behavior. At his old school, people used to flinch at every word he uttered, bit their lips and clench their mouths shut as though to force themselves not to reply. That was how his quirk was activated, after all. Respond to a question, and Shinso had complete control. It didn't help that he hadn't exactly practiced it and so struggled to not take control, even for a second, before he could turn it off again. He thought he'd gotten better at it, but a little slip-up at lunch resulted in a classmate dropping their tray down the front of their shirt. Shinso stammered that it was an accident, but the person in question was quite a stubborn, headstrong soul, who squinted her eyes at him accusingly and demanded the truth. Shinso told them all in that following homeroom, insisting that he didn't have much control and that it was an accident, but he wasn't believed. It didn't help that he was quite sure the rest of his class whispered behind his back anyway, thinking that he was creepy or whatever. Shinso tried not to pay much attention to it. But then he started to get frustrated. He didn't help himself by pulling the occasional trick on them when they got really infuriating, or forcing them to shut up when they just wouldn't. And so came that moment when they talked to Present Mike, and Shinso knew it hadn't been the first nor last time it would happen. Then he started to notice the eyes of Class A wander to his general direction. He knew all about their gold-banded class president, he'd looked him up. Izuku Midoriya, number 18, was completely quirkless, and absolutely despised heroes, according to the internet, at least. The facts kind of added up, to be honest, and that short, unseeming boy radiated this terrifying aura, magnified by his villainous classmates, especially number 15, the infamous Shoto Todoroki. Then the sports festival came along and all that happened. It was weird, how closely Midoriya had clearly been paying attention to him. But actually, the class was pretty nice. Freaky, but nice. Shinso was quite happy with the sports festival outcome. He found himself silently rooting for Class A the entire time, especially after he was finally knocked out of the competition. It was bound to happen eventually, and he bested one of the last hero course members. He was pretty chuffed about that. Class 1C? Not so much. And then came that week-long break, and Shinso just had to go and screw himself over. He lugged his belongings into the back of the Class 1A teacher's car and sighed as he clambered into the back seat. He didn't wave his parents goodbye as the car pulled away, although they stayed by the door and waved anyway. Shinso watched them fade into the distance, the car joining the main road. He didn't live particularly close to UA. It was half an hour by train and certainly longer by car. He'd be here for a while, with this strange teacher who he now desperately needed to impress if he wanted to get himself out of Class 1A anytime soon. Mr. Aizawa was an underground pro hero, who went by the name Eraserhead. He was pretty cool, actually. Shinso wanted to be a hero a lot like him, but he wouldn't admit that to his face, not a chance. "You get why this is happening, kid?" he asked after quite a while of radio silence between the two. Literally, he turned the radio off after about a minute of suffering through present mix screaming on a rerun of one of his radio shows. Shinso was silently disappointed. He already missed his old homeroom teacher, in some weird, Stockholm Syndrome kind of way. Shinso didn't reply. He just stared out the window and at his own reflection in it. It was getting dark already, and rain pitter-pattered against the glass whilst the traffic was at a halt. Mr. Aizawa was looking at him through the rear-view mirror. He tried not to catch his eye. His new teacher sighed as the traffic started to move again. "First step towards graduating, figure out why you're here." Now Shinso was just frustrated. "Well, it's not my fault," he hissed before he could stop himself. Mr. Aizawa didn't say anything, he just kept driving. Shinso sighed, "You know why I'm here, and so do I. Then tell me." He didn't reply for a moment, just frowning at his own reflection. "I screwed up," he admitted. "I shouldn't have gotten angry, alright? I just couldn't help it. People saw me in the sports festival with Class A and now I'm more of a villain than ever. You don't get how bad it got, no one does, and no one believes me. They won't believe you if you don't tell them." He rolled his eyes. "There's no point in trying. That's the thing with people. Everyone makes up their mind before they know all the facts, they judge the book by its cover, and there's nothing I can do about it. Kid, I've seen this case 1,000 times before." Shinso finally looked up to stare at the back of his head whilst he spoke. "Whether it be at UA or working as a hero, there are far too many out there labeled as the bad guy because of their quirk. Your new classmates would agree, and so do I. But one thing they don't get quite yet, is that judging a book by its cover can go both ways, alright? People judge you, and in turn, you judge them. Why do you think they're acting like that? Why are they being like this? Insecurities are skin deep. All you need to do is to open the book to page 1. I knew those guys," Shinso interjected, now picking at his jeans. "They were from my old school, lived in my neighborhood. I've known them for years, it's not like that. I'd tell you I was the victim, that it was self-defense, but I'm going to class and now so obviously I wasn't believed. It may have been self-defense at first, but you got carried away, didn't you?" Shinso opened his mouth to reply, but quickly realized he had no valid response. He gritted his teeth and turned back to the window, mulling it over in his mind. Okay, maybe he had gotten carried away. But he hadn't done much. So what if ordered one to drag the other into a fountain, and maybe he'd forgotten the little bit about drowning. It didn't get that far anyway. He just wanted to give them a scare. But someone else saw and called the police. There was a knock on Shinso's door not long after and 2 soaking teenagers watched with matching grins when the officer insisted that Shinso would have to come back with her to the police station until his parents, who were out at work, could arrive to sort out the situation. Shinso really knew he was in deep trouble when that same officer laid out all his complaints and accusations of quirk-based assault over the years and said there would have to be some kind of disciplinary action for this. But she recognized him from the sports festival and gave him an ultimatum: if she and his parents could talk this over with UA and convince them to transfer Shinso into Class 1A, then the system would pick him up and these charges could be dropped. No juvie for him. And so, here he was. I know you're aiming for the hero course, Mr. Aizawa continued, which made Shinso flinch. But you can't be a hero if you act out in anger. He didn't reply. Class A will help you. They're aiming for the hero course too. Wait, what? Shinso looked up, furrowing his brow. Wait, how? They won the sports festival, didn't they? Yes, but Midoriya has been bargaining with Principal Nizu. They'll explain the rest. They didn't speak again for the remainder of the car journey. Shinso wallowed in his own thoughts, trying to decipher what all this meant. That hopeful spark was rising up in his chest again. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. The car pulled into UA. Whilst listening to rules that Mr. Aizawa slowly listed off to him, Shinso unloaded his belongings from the back of the car. They waited for the support course teacher, Power Loader, to turn up with a tracking device that was soon secured around Shinso's ankle, meaning he couldn't leave the school grounds until the summer break. The Class A dorms, Heights Alliance, loomed over them. Shinso had seen it dozens of times before, but only in passing. He'd never been inside. They were planning some kind of welcome, Mr. Aizawa warned Shinso as they approached. But to my knowledge, they got a little distracted. Oh. Shinso asked nervously. They were right at the door now. I haven't seen them much today, he admitted. But their other teachers sensed some tension, and Midoriya didn't look too happy. Not a good sign. No, it isn't. He opened the door and they stepped inside. Class. Mr. Aizawa called out. It was eerily silent inside. Shinso couldn't help but think that this was unusual. Oh, the girl with the number 20 on her back hurried over. Hello. And Shinso. Good to see you again, I'm assuming you're our new classmate. Yayorozu, Mr. Aizawa sighed. Ah, yes, that was her name. Shinso totally didn't forget. No, it's Yayorozu with the knife. How could he forget? What happened this time? Her smile looked a little fixed. Oh, nothing. It's fine. Mr. Aizawa simply sighed again. Well, I suppose you know Yayorozu, 19, she's your vice president now. It took Shinso a few moments to process that sentence. He thought Aizawa was vice president, but maybe that had changed. And wasn't Yayorozu number 20? Who was number, Shinso was number 19. Where is Midoriya? Mr. Aizawa asked Yayorozu. Well, he just got back from detention. I think he's in the bathrooms. He actually went to detention. I believe so. Shinso's eyes flicked around the common room area. It was pretty similar to Class 1 CS, to be honest, although he'd always avoided that place unless he wanted coffee. God, he hoped Class A had coffee. His thoughts were interrupted by the slam of a door, which made a majority of the members of Class A, scattered around the room, jump and look up. Midoriya stormed out of the bathrooms, absolutely soaking wet, like he'd been standing outside in the rain. He didn't even look at Shinso, about to walk right past towards the stairs up to their individual rooms. 18, Mr. Aizawa almost snapped. Midoriya hesitated by the bottom of the stairs, not even turning his head. Aren't you going to welcome Shinso? He whipped his head around, water dripping from his weighed down hair, vibrant green eyes almost glowing in obvious anger. Welcome, he snapped. Shinso's hands clenched around his suitcase as Midoriya marched up the stairs and out of sight. To hell, scoffed someone else, just out of Shinso's line of sight. He felt his heart beat a little faster. It wasn't going to be coffee that stopped him from sleeping tonight. It was a completely ordinary start to the day. Relatively. Raccoon eyes. I know that was freaking you. Mina howled with laughter as she shrieked and ran into the sanctuary of the girls' bathrooms, avoiding Kiken's wrath. Midoriya blinked at the scene. It didn't take long for him to zero in on the whiteboard with their names on it and realizing it had once again been vandalized to say Kiken in bright pink bubble font, surrounded by little flowers and stars. Yayorozu put a cup of tea in Midoriya's hands. Good morning, she said cheerfully. Midoriya noted the new silver bands on her blazer. He smiled and took a sip of the tea. He never thought he'd appreciate tea as much as he did now that it was Yayorozu approved, and not the cheap stuff UA bought in bulk for them. Ashido. Please do not draw on the board with permanent pen, cried out Aitsa, now lacking those silver bands. She poked her head out of the door just as Siro said, You're not vice president anymore, Aitsa, we don't have to listen to you. Yeah. Mina grinned, before yelling and slamming the door shut again when Kakan threw a book at her. It hit the door and fell to the ground. He's, vice. Hagakure suggested. Everyone looked to Yayorozu and Midoriya, who exchanged glances and shrugged. Sounds about right, Midoriya agreed. I'm not listening to vice, called out Mina's muffled voice, I want to live. Please leave the bathroom. Aitsa attempted, you are blocking its entrance to those who need it. He just wants to see murder, Siro interjected. This resulted in a lot more back and forth until Yayorozu finally stepped in. They did as she said immediately, probably just to irritate Aitsa. Here. Midoriya blinked as his notebook was shoved into his arms. Yurika walked past him. She must have taken it again. Yurika, are you okay? He frowned. He'd been worried about her throughout the entire break, but Shoto's and Aitsa's situations kind of got in the way. She ignored him as she glanced around the common room, finally settling on the floating uniform that represented Hagakure. Yurika tapped her on the shoulder. Yeah, she asked as she turned around, what's up? You handed me in. And that's when it all went wrong. Midoriya had thought it was Kirishima, at first, the person that Yurika had encountered before Ue. But it just didn't add up. Now it was so much clearer, it was Hagakure. Both girls had been active villains. Sure, they hadn't been in the same area, but they did the same job, and both moved around a lot. Yurika was Hagakure's competition, and as it seems, Yurika had little clue that the invisible girl had clocked her as a rival at all. Everyone stared whilst Yurika laid out her accusation. They obviously couldn't see the expression on Hagakure's face, but it wasn't hard to guess. She caved in quickly, admitting the truth. I didn't know you then. Hagakure insisted, waving her arms about, evident by the movement of her sleeves, as she backed away from Yurika. Midoriya had never seen her look so furious. I didn't even realize you were Zero until the sports festival, she continued. It was just never mentioned. Oh, or maybe I just never listened, I'm sorry, okay. Midoriya put down his notebook and mug to jump in between them, facing Yurika and holding his hands out. Hold on, he insisted. Why don't you, explain your thought process here? She handed me over to the police. Yurika exclaimed, her outcry surprising anyone in the vicinity. You should have seen the looks on my parents' faces when they turned up at the door. Midoriya lowered his hands when he saw the tears welling in her eyes. They said it was alright, back at home last week. But I know they weren't telling the truth. You have no idea what that felt like. Well, I do, Hagakure retorted, leaning over Midoriya's shoulders. He could feel her hands grip the sides of his blazer. I got caught too, remember? You were caught on the job. Yurika yelled, actually yelled. Whilst I had to sit there and lie to their faces to try and get away with it. It's different with you because at least it wasn't unexpected. Midoriya heard her gasp by his ear, hey. What on earth does that mean? You think I could have never been anything else other than just a thief? That's what you thought? Yurika jabbed a finger at her, weaving around Midoriya. That's why you did it? But I didn't have a choice. My mum and dad are struggling to pay rent now that they don't have my money. And they paid back as much as they could. You don't know how heartbreaking it was to see them like that, and it's your fault, she sobbed. Midoriya was just shocked. He hadn't expected this to happen, it came completely out of the blue. Yurika's reaction was far from logical. It must have been tough at home, really tough. The response was emotional. Also slightly terrifying, considering both Yurika and Hagakure were very skilled fighters and Midoriya was standing between them. We're going to be late for homeroom, Yayorozu inputted nervously. All I wanted was for them to live the life they deserved to have. Yurika cried, tears falling down her round cheeks like rivers. I didn't want to be a villain, I was just trying to be their hero. But you did it on purpose. For fun, for your own benefit. And people look at me on the street and they know I'm a villain now, I'm on the news, they talk about me. They're scared of me, because you made it a story, because you made it so that a bunch of officers had to arrest a teenager for a bunch of robberies, and I didn't even do all of them. But I couldn't prove that. I bet you haven't been stopped at a store, saying you can't go in because you're a convicted thief. And I can't do anything about it. She broke out into hysterical sobs, dropping to the floor with her head in her hands. Slowly, Midoriya knelt down in front of her, reaching forwards to put a hand on her shoulder. "Hey, it's alright," he tried. "And no, it's not. Well, you ended up here," Midoriya smiled softly. "And we all know that was bad at first, but, well, it wasn't that bad in the end, right? Surely you didn't want to go all your life as a villain." She didn't reply for a moment, her shoulders shaking. Eventually, hands still covering her face, she shook her head. I'm really sorry, Eureka," Hagakure said in a tone that implied it was heartfelt. I don't know what else to say." Clearly, it wasn't that, because Eureka shot back up again, face red and covered in tears, fists clenched and shaking. Midoriya leapt up in front of her. "Eureka, you have to remember that this is a class for people who made mistakes, alright?" She wavered, gaze returning to him. "Okay. And we're trying to figure out how to fix it. We've all done a lot of stuff we regret, and most of us are still trying to get their heads around that, me included. But we can't change what happened." The anger faded from her expression again. She covered her face and shook her head, still sobbing with short, squeaky inhalations. After a moment more, she sniffed and rubbed her eyes with the back of her arm. "Momo said we'll be late for class." Still crying, she picked up her backpack, pulled on her shoes, and hurried out the front door. Everyone stood there in shock for about a minute. Without a single word between them, they all slowly gathered their things together and left for homeroom. By the time that Midoriya arrived, nearly everyone was there. Eureka sat on the opposite side of the room to him. She had her head in a notebook. Oh, that was his notebook, right, of course. Wait, when did she take that back from? "Sit down, 18, insisted Mr. Aizawa, and Midoriya scuttled across the room to take his seat. "You're late," he snapped at the dwindling members of Class A as they arrived, muttering their apologies. He squinted at their expressions, perhaps realizing that something was up. Regardless, he took the register, reminded them all that their new number 19 would be arriving after school hours that day. Oh, and Midoriya would be starting his detention this week and Itza the next, and left them be to attend to his own business. The day passed slowly. Midoriya tried to focus on his own work, especially with exams coming up. Their new timetable said that they would have also had their first hero-based lessons that day, but it didn't happen for one reason or another, possibly because Mr. Aizawa was busy, or because the new student hadn't arrived yet, maybe because it was their first day of lessons. Anyway, it didn't matter, today wasn't the best day for it anyway. And so came lunch. They were quiet in the queue, up until the inevitable happened. "So, I heard that the most prestigious members of Class A were up to no good again." Monoma laughed. "Not now, Monoma," Midoriya told him, ignoring the glances that had been plaguing him and the others ever since they arrived at the hall. "If Stain wanted to save you, then you really must be." "I said not now," Midoriya snapped. He stopped talking, as did everyone else around him. "Okay," Monoma blinked, "sorry." Midoriya sighed and turned back to the queue, his friends following suit. They got their food and sat down together, only to eat in silence. "Are you feeling better?" Shoto nervously asked Eureka. It wasn't like him to try and initiate conversation. Eureka must have appreciated it, because she stopped prodding her food and gave him a sniff and a smile, her face still a little pinker than usual, eyes a little redder. She nodded slightly and returned to not eating. "Good." More silence. "Maybe you should talk to her," Tsu suggested. Eureka shrugged. "It could help." Another shrug. This was clearly going nowhere, and so she stopped trying. Eventually, Midoriya couldn't take it anymore. He shoveled all the food he could stomach into his mouth and tidied away his tray, leaving before anyone could follow him. He didn't have anywhere to go other than their classroom, so that's where he went. "Do I say anyway," said Hagakure as Midoriya slid open the door. "There's nothing I can do." "Oh, hi, Midoriya." "Hi," he replied glumly, sitting down in his place not far behind her. He reached into his bag to glance at his notebook, maybe at the page he'd done for Hagakure, but it wasn't there. He sighed. "You need to talk to Eureka," he told Hagakure. "Yeah, we know," Ajiro nodded glumly. "We were just saying, but we're a little stuck." "There's got to be something," Midoriya insisted, leaning back and staring at the ceiling, as though the answers would be up there. Kaken let out a small laugh. Midoriya glared at the back of his head. What? He snapped as though he could feel his glare, turning around to glare right back at him. The answer's freaking obvious. Oh yeah? Midoriya raised an eyebrow. He rolled his eyes. Girls are so freaking emotional. Punch it out. Midoriya let out a laugh of his own. Not everything is solved by violence, Kaken. Stop freaking calling me that. He pointed a finger at him, and I'm right, so stop acting all high and mighty because you're not. This has nothing to do with me. Maybe if you didn't stalk the entire class and write it in that bloody notebook, then Round Face would never know. It's not a bad thing that she knows. She's freaking sobbing her head off. Since when did you care about other people's emotions? Guys, just stop, yelled Hagakure, and Midoriya became suddenly aware that she was crying too, from the tone of her voice, the twitching of her floating uniform. You just argue all the time. Tell me I'm wrong, Kaken snarled at them. Most of the class other than Midoriya's close friendship group was by Hagakure, trying to comfort her. If that notebook didn't exist, then this wouldn't have happened. He leaned back in his chair casually. None of this would have ever gone to hell if Invisible was able to go up to Round Face and explain it on her own freaking terms. Midoriya shrunk a little into his chair. He hated how absolutely right he was. Well, it's not my fault that Yurika keeps stealing my notebook. And there wasn't even much in there. She could have figured it out herself. And we can fix this. Yurika just needs some time to think it over, and then I can. For God's sake, you can't solve everything. Kaken yelled at him. Just admit that you messed up and get rid of the freaking book. No. Midoriya exclaimed. I'm not getting rid of my book. That's my... Guys, interjected Kirishima. Midoriya looked up at him as he gestured back at Hagakure. Sorry, Midoriya muttered. Kaken did no such thing. Eventually, Yurika returned behind everyone else. They all made their way to their seats in silence, and the rest of the day continued in the same theme that the rest of it had, tense and quiet. Midoriya knew he needed to fix this. But that evening, he wasn't the one who spoke up first. Before everyone could part ways, and were still in the common room area, Kirishima stood up and cleared his throat. Okay, time to talk it out. What? Said Hagakure. He put one hand on Hagakure's shoulder, and the other on Yurika's before she could escape. In his solid grip, he pulled the two girls towards the door and opened it. Just have a little chat? Please. Outside for just a moment. If it doesn't work, then I get it. But you both know you don't want to keep this up forever. To Midoriya's surprise, they agreed to it. Hagakure went outside first, and after a little more hesitation from Yurika, she too, put on her shoes and went outside. Kirishima closed the door behind them as they sat down on the front porch, and he marched back over to the others. Wow, good job, blinked Kaminari. Now on a roll, Kirishima put his hands on his hips and grinned. Right, now Midoriya and Bakugo. What? Midoriya said immediately. Not a chance in hell, Kaken said in a low grumble, already heading back towards his room. Kirishima put out an arm to stop him. And you guys are gonna talk it out in here, because we can't trust one of you to punch the other. The fact that wasn't aimed at just Kaken concerned Midoriya a little. Why are we talking? Midoriya questioned nervously. Because you guys have had a bad relationship from the start. Kirishima proclaimed. Mr. Aizawa even said that you can't graduate until you can get along, remember? And there's no way we can all be heroes if we can't put our past behind us, like Hagakure and Yurika. So, we're getting to the bottom of this. We are abso-freaking-lutely not, Kaken snapped at Kirishima. Unfazed, Kirishima turned him around and steered him back into the common room, indicating at the chair opposite Midoriya at the table he was doing his maths homework at. Kaken crossed his arms and glared at Midoriya furiously. Midoriya tried to return to his work, but Aiza promptly arrived to gather it up and slide it out of reach, taking the pen right out of his hand. Unsure, Midoriya tapped his fingers against each other. I'm not doing this, Kaken attempted, and failed, to leave. For God's sake, he yelled at Kirishima, I hate his freaking guts and talking it out ain't gonna freaking change that. Midoriya frowned at him, that's not very nice. Kaken rolled his eyes, oh, that's not very nice, shut the hell up, it's your freaking fault that I'm here in the first place. Midoriya shrugged, yeah, but you deserved it? He slammed his hands down on the table. I didn't deserve SH. Come on, man, Kirishima intervened. You can't just sit there and say you don't need to be in this class as much as the rest of us. Kaken crossed his arms again, not looking Midoriya in the eyes as he said, I may have not been acting like the freaking hero I wanted to be before you, I get it, I was a jerk. Midoriya perked up a little. Don't give me that look. Kaken growled at him, you weren't any better and you still ain't any better. I'm trying to help everyone here, Midoriya frowned, and you're still calling me a villain. I think we've established that you can still be a villain whilst trying to help someone, he retorted, indicating towards the door that Uraraka and Hagakure were behind. It was a reasonable point but didn't exactly apply. The conversation had seemed to have run dry, so Kirishima took the chair next to Kaken and said, so, why do you dislike Midoriya so much? Midoriya really wasn't enjoying this conversation. Cause he's a freaking Deku. Wow, I've missed that name, Midoriya said sarcastically. Kaken glared daggers at him, and he's freaking delusional. What? Midoriya exclaimed, why am I delusional? Because you're a quirkless Deku who still thinks he can be a hero. Oh, the same old taunt. It didn't hurt any less. I can be a hero, Midoriya insisted. He'd had just enough of this accusation. No, you can't. I can, I thought we already got past this in the sports festival. You got that far in the freaking sports festival because we allowed it? You would have fell at the first hurdle without us. You don't know that. He barked a laugh, I freaking do. Midoriya slammed his hands down on the table and stood up, I can be a hero and I've had it up to here with you telling me that I can't. Because I'm just the only one who's freaking brave enough to speak up about it. All Might did too. And Shoto. Principal Nizu is going to let him take the licensing exam, acknowledged Tsu. He wouldn't have even offered if he didn't think he could pass it. Midoriya smiled at her. He would be a dead weight, Kaken snapped back at her. Heroes are people with the quirks to help where other people can't. Deku doesn't freaking have that. That doesn't mean I can't help, Midoriya insisted. Kaken whipped his head back around to him, you'll die the second you face someone alone with a minutely strong quirk, and ensure that no one with a weak quirk will ever be allowed to get a hero license again. You don't know that? Mr. Aizawa made it? He fights quirkless. Huh? You know that's not the same freaking thing. You're in denial, you're delusional, have been ever since that bloody day you realized your quirk was never coming. And you still think you're a hero. You're not. And it's freaking annoying. Do something useful with your life. Where you can for once not be the stinking Deku you've always been. Still standing up, Midoriya snarled at him, glaring with all the anger he could muster, I will be a hero. Kaken finally stood up too, brushing Kirishima's hand away, you will always be nothing, you don't deserve to be the freaking leader of this class, acting all high and mighty and powerful. You cannot be a hero, get it into your freaking head. So what, huh? Midoriya found himself yelling back at him, I can be a villain, but I can't be a hero. I can ruin everything, but I'm not allowed to help. Why should you care if I'd be a good hero or not? If I can save one person, then isn't it worth it? The only person you need to save is yourself. Get your head out of the clouds and stop ignoring everything that doesn't fit what you want. And that's why I freaking hate you, because you refuse to see. You'll get out of this school one day and realize that I was right, and you are and will always be nothing. No. You are the one who's delusional. Midoriya exclaimed, walking around the table to look the taller boy right in the eyes. He realized he was clutching at straws as he stammered, thinking you're always better than me and everyone else just because you were born with a big powerful quirk and I wasn't. Yeah, he scoffed, I have a quirk, one that can combat anyone in this class, and any villain out there, and you don't. The strange calmness of his voice was somehow worse than his shouting. Kaken glanced up at the clock on the wall, don't you have detention for playing hero? Shaking with fury, Midoriya swallowed the lump in his throat, turned, pulled on his shoes, and threw open the door. Midoriya. Kirishima called out after him. He could just hear him telling Kaken he'd been too harsh, clearly regretting initiating the interaction at all, as he walked away. Midoriya, asked Hagakure as he stepped past her and out of the cover the porch provided. Deku, what happened? Uraraka questioned, standing up. Don't call me that, he snapped, and trudged down the sodden pathway, letting the rain dampen his hair and mingle with his tears. "Izuku, you're soaking wet," proclaimed Toga when Midoriya stormed into the support labs. The other students literally threw themselves out of his path as Midoriya stomped over to Toga's and Hatsume's corner of the lab. "I know," he barely managed to say as he sat down in a spare chair. The two girls exchanged glances as he slammed his head down on the desk. "You okay there?" asked Hatsume over the sound of Toga slurping from a juice box, not dissimilar to Mr. Aizawa, come to think of it. Midoriya didn't reply, mainly because he was worried that if he spoke, he'd burst into tears, and that would be embarrassing. Troubles with good old Class A. May guessed with a giggle, returning to whatever she was working on. Midoriya shrugged, which was confirmation enough. "Oh, which one?" Toga asked eagerly. "Was it, explosion guy? You don't like him, right?" "It's always him," Midoriya moaned, sitting up and wiping the water from his face. "You should just get rid of him." Toga joked happily, sitting down and spinning in the wheelie chair beside May. "Considering it? Detention-y," May suddenly exclaimed, holding out her hand, "Get me my screwdriver." "Oh, right," Midoriya sniffed, pushing off the desk and sliding across the room to find her toolkit, which was often spread liberally across the room. He found one on the floor and promptly handed it back to her. "What did he do?" Toga asked. "Wrong screwdriver." Midoriya took it back and tossed it to where he'd found it whilst he searched for a second. He just... "I don't know, he's just annoying." He handed another option to Hatsume. "What kind of annoying?" "Still wrong." Midoriya hesitated before taking the screwdriver back. There was another one just below her hand. So, he swapped the two around. Just, always insisting I can't do anything because I'm quirkless." "Perfect." May sung happily as the screwdriver fit the piece she was tampering with. Toga took one last sip of the juice box before tossing it at the bin. She missed. Evidently, she did that a lot. "Well, he sucks." Midoriya shrugged, "It just... I hated how he's right." Toga rolled her eyes, "He's not." "But I can't be a real hero," Midoriya told her. He turned to face her, "Can I?" She pulled a face and fiddled with the height of her chair, "Depends on what you mean by hero." Midoriya groaned in frustration, pulling at his hair, "Why does this always happen to me? Why do I keep going in this loop of you can and you can't?" "Probably because you don't know what you want to do," she hummed. "You're stuck, it's a Class A thing. I was the same." Midoriya got up and started pacing back and forth. "When I arrived here, I'd made up my mind, the whole hero thing was stupid, all heroes were stupid, I hated UA and I just needed to get out. And then? I don't know. I changed my mind. I thought that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't so utterly useless after all." "You're not useless to us," Toga pouted. "Yeah but, that's not, ugh. I don't know. It's heroes. The whole hero system. It doesn't work. It just creates this equilibrium of more heroes and more villains and back and forth and I'm stuck in the middle of it." Toga pushed herself across the room on the wheelie chair, slowly drifting towards her mini fridge. Midoriya continued to pace in circles, not caring that the other support course members were starting to look up and listen in. It just makes me think, do I even want to continue like this? Even if I manage to become a hero, then what? I'd face the same problems I always have. The same, bigotry. There was silence for a moment, with Midoriya standing solemnly in the middle of the room, staring at his shoes. Toga kicked the door of her mini fridge shut. "So, why are you in Class A anyway?" Midoriya sighed, pushing his hair out of his eyes. "I yelled at some heroes and stuff. There's probably a video of it online somewhere, I haven't looked." No, Toga smiled, rolling her eyes as she stabbed a straw through a juice box. "Wait, no, coconut milk, box. Like, what are you supposed to be learning?" Midoriya frowned at her. She sighed. "At the start of the year, Mr. Aizawa always does this thing where he's like, 'Oh, you'll graduate when you understand why you're really here,'" she said with a mockingly low and monotone voice. She paused to sip her drink, "And then you're like, what? It's so obviously why I'm here, I did X, Y, and Z. And then time goes on and you think, oh, wait, I did that because I was feeling this, and I had to do that. And then you'll figure out what you want to do about it and why it was wrong, and then what you want to do going forwards, and then you graduate, get it? He stared at her blankly. Okay, she nodded, putting the carton down. Okay. So, you shouted at some heroes or something. So, why did you do that? Because, they deserved it? Alright, and you've pretty much already answered this question, but why was doing that wrong? Midoriya blinked at her. I don't know if it was. She nodded with a confident smile. Yep. You're not ready to graduate? Well, I don't know about that. Mr. Aizawa said I could transfer to this course a while back. She waved the comment off, glancing over at what May was doing in the process. He does that, lie, rational deceptions. You think he lied? Probably. She clearly thought that was the end of the conversation. Toga started chattering to May about whatever trinket they were working on whilst Midoriya furrowed his brow, lost in his thoughts. It didn't matter too much if he wasn't ready to graduate. He kind of expected it. The fact that he was currently standing in detention was a contributing factor. Back when he was talking with Mr. Aizawa about all this, he was on that downward slope again, of not thinking he could be a hero. He supposed it made sense for Mr. Aizawa to want to give him some incentive to keep going. What was consuming his mind was more the thought of, he wasn't ready, because of the very same factor that started it all. He still didn't completely comprehend why he was here. He understood the fundamentals. He knew why Principal Nizu wanted him to be here, he knew why All Might did, and that the world thought he should be. Whether it was the right idea or not, no one could really know yet, but that didn't matter. What he didn't understand was putting Kaken in UA wrong? No. Was shouting at those heroes for not doing their job wrong? No. And was it his fault he knew All Might's secrets? Certainly not. So, how could he learn why those things were wrong, if they weren't? It doesn't make sense, he suddenly exclaimed. Why not? May yelled in response. Oh, wait, you're not talking about my wiring, never mind. Ignoring her, Midoriya started to pace again. I know why they didn't like what I did, but it wasn't wrong. You probably went about it in the wrong way, Toga hummed. No, Midoriya retorted firmly, I didn't, and if I were to be sent back in time, I'd do it again. And they'd send you back here. This isn't some place that the heroes can just chuck all their problems. Toga shrugged. It works, though. He let out a slight laugh. Yeah, right. The whole system is corrupt. May finally looked up from her work in progress to properly listen in alongside Toga. She wasn't the only one, but Midoriya just wasn't focusing on the eyes that stared at him from every angle. The only people that it really works for are those at the very top, he snarled. And everyone else just has to hope they'll get there. But me. I'm never going to. I'm always going to be at the very bottom because of something I was born without. A power I can never get, and I am not just going to sit there and suffer through life just because I don't fit into the perfect little mold society made out for me. And I'm not the only one, am I? Someone has to do something about it. If it's not me, it doesn't look like it's going to be anyone. And if that means burning the bloody whole thing to the freaking ground, then so be it. Silence, filled only by the sound of Toga slurping her drink. Oh, she suddenly said, with the tone of someone who had just come to a realization. She clicked her fingers and smiled, that's why you're here. Midoriya blinked at her again, breath catching in his throat as he thought over what had just slipped out of his mouth. He sounded an awful lot like a villain then. An awful lot like. I think we'd all get along so well if you gave us the chance. We have such similar motives. Midoriya turned on his heel and marched away. Hey. Where are you going? May called out. Midoriya didn't reply. He let the door to the lab slam behind him. He blinked and he was standing out in the rain, in front of Heights Alliance. What did he do? Why? What did he do wrong? He stared up at the sky for a moment, blinking furiously as the raindrops fell onto his eyelashes and dribbled down his face. He was stuck in the same loop Shoto had been in. Only Shoto actually had a future. Gritting his teeth, Midoriya stormed forwards. He threw open the door, tossed off his shoes, and marched right through the common room to the bathrooms. A few people tried to greet him, including Eureka, but he ignored them. He found himself standing before a mirror, hands gripping the sides of a sink. He stared at his own reflection. Mind blank, he just focused on the green of his own eyes, partially hidden by his soaked hair, appearing black with the water. Eventually, he heard some commotion in the common room. The distant voice of Mr. Izawa reached his ears. No, he couldn't deal with this right now. He stormed through the bathroom door, still dripping with rainwater, the weight on his shoulders greater than ever. 18, Mr. Izawa snapped as he passed him. Midoriya hesitated by the bottom of the stairs, refusing to turn and meet his eyes. Aren't you going to welcome Shinso? He turned around quickly, eyes settling on that of Shinso, the new member of Class A. He must have looked furious, frightened, even, from the suppressed yet panicked look that Shinso gave him in response. Welcome, Midoriya said, spitting the word like unintended venom. Not caring to remedy the mistake, Midoriya turned and marched up the rest of the stairs. He just heard Siro's voice add to his welcome. To hell. Midoriya silently agreed. Chapter 28, Should I Be Sorry? Shinso didn't think he'd see Midoriya at all for the rest of that evening. He had dinner in silence with the rest of his new class, distancing himself the best he could. After that, he was directed to his room by student 14, Tokoyami, with the bird head, who was also on his floor. Shinso stared at the light switch on his wall for a moment, which was beside a rather worrying message that warned him not to turn off the corridor lights, at risk of 14's shadow quirk going crazy and attacking them all. Oh, and next to him, was student number 1, whose laser power just might burst out unexpectedly and destroy the walls. It wasn't a ridiculous warning, Shinso had heard the rumors. And of course, the person who roomed right next door to Shinso, was the infamous student 18, Midoriya himself, who looked just about ready to stab someone, last Shinso had seen of him. This didn't make Shinso at all relaxed, especially when after brushing his teeth and trying to make his way back to his room in one piece, the door next to his creaked open. Hi. Shinso said nervously to Midoriya, who stood blankly in his doorway, head hanging low. 18 cleared his throat. Yeah, hi, he sighed and looked up. He seemed exhausted. Look. I'm sorry about earlier, I just wasn't in a good mood. Yeah, no kidding. He only realized that was probably a little harsh after he'd said it. Midoriya shuffled side to side awkwardly. Yeah. I'm really sorry, he repeated. You didn't deserve that. I know you needed us to be accommodating or something, and I was being anything but. He sighed, I had a bit of an argument with Kaken, Bibakugo, 17. Explosion guy. Earlier. We don't get along very well and. I don't know. It's okay, Shinso nodded. You're not the only one who lashes out at people from time to time. It would be rather hypocritical of Shinso to say anything otherwise. Midoriya just nodded, giving him a weak smile. Anyway, I should probably warn you. The alarm clocks all go off at the same time in the morning and I haven't gotten around to taking them apart and stopping them from doing that. So, yeah, sorry, you'll probably be forced to wake up quite abruptly. Not your fault, Shinso shrugged. Well, I thought I'd warn you anyway. Oh, speaking of warnings, the light switch. Oh, don't worry about that, Tokoyami and Dark Shadow are doing pretty well at the moment, you can turn off the light. I can. Yeah, it'll be fine. Well, if you're sure. Yeah, well, good night. Night. And Midoriya closed the door again. Shinso stood there for a moment, mulling the interaction over in his head. He supposed these people were only human, they were kids too, like him. Midoriya suddenly felt an awful lot less terrifying. He was just upset. Shinso got like that too. Even though he knew he wouldn't be getting much sleep that night, Shinso felt a whole lot more comfortable after that. Mirio was a diligent student, and although he'd never say it himself, he was probably the best in UA at the time. And, with some extra help from All Might, he was probably still the best when compared with numerous other times of UA. You see, Mirio had a bit of a secret. He was in this position for a very good reason. Although his mentor insisted that he could have made it to the top alone, there was no ignoring the assistance he'd had getting there. Mirio's quirk, naturally, was a lot more simple than it displayed itself now. For his entire life, he'd only been able to pass through solid objects once his quirk had been activated. He'd learned to be tricky with it, find every little method and clever idea to get this blade to have a real gleam to it. He was doing well, at the beginning of his third year at UA. He could remember clearly, sitting in the lunch hall and closely watching the arrival of the new Class 1A. He'd seen 3 of them come and go now, but this one didn't seem to be going anywhere. And when they arrived, Mirio noticed something particularly special about the green-haired boy who soon became class president. And it was something about that conversation he'd had with the first-year hero course in front of the whole school on that fateful day. He remembered talking to All Might about it. "Sir, do you know much about Class 1A?" he had asked. All Might blinked at him from over his cup of tea, sitting opposite each other in the little room they'd speak in from time to time. They'd only really known each other for a few months prior to the beginning of the school year, but Mirio already owed this man more than he could ever seem to appreciate. Not so much, the currently skeletal-looking hero admitted. That was the big problem with All Might's power at the moment, it was failing him. "Why do you ask?" Mirio frowned as he put his empty cup down on the table. "I overheard something at lunch. It made me think of the story you told me about your power." "Our power, my boy?" "Yeah, that was the other thing. All Might's power wasn't just super strength or flight or anything like that. His real power was the ability to pass it on. One for All was its name. The ability had cultivated over 9 holders now, growing stronger as it went, picking up more and more with each hero. Mirio was next." Mirio had laughed. "I suppose you're right." "Well, what did you hear?" his mentor pressed. "Oh, right, you see. I remember you saying. One for All has a mirror power, right? All for One." All Might's expression grew dark, the way it always did when the subject was at hand. He nodded. "The power to take?" "Yes. Well, one of the Class 1A kids, I think he has something similar." All Might nearly choked on his drink. "Principal Nizu never mentioned that." "Did he not? That's kind of strange. What did you hear exactly?" "Oh, well, I saw a few of Class 1A speaking to Class 1B. I knew something was going to happen, it always does between those two classes. It did when I was in 1B, there's always some kind of rivalry. Anyway, one of Class B has this copy quirk. I suppose that holds similarities to All for One as well, but that's not what I'm talking about. There was this other boy, from 1A, he took the copy power. The copy quirk boy was left without his power at all. It was super weird, had to be a quirk. I asked around and apparently this guy, the kid with 18 on his back, has the ability to steal other quirks." All Might stared at him for a moment. "Wait a moment, did you say 18? That's the one." He furrowed his brow for a moment, deep in thought, before clapping his hand over his forehead and letting out a sigh of relief. "No, number 18 doesn't have anything like All for One. You scared me for a minute there, young Mirio." "Oh? Then what's his quirk?" 18's real name is Izuku Midoriya, and he's completely quirkless. Mirio soon learned the history Midoriya and All Might had. He winced at the thought. It clearly wasn't an encounter that went well on either end. Midoriya became an area of great interest for All Might for a good while after. There was the incident at the USJ, then the numerous escape plots, and let's not forget the ruckus he caused at the sports festival. This was why, when the home visits rolled around, the hero Mirio was interning under, All Might's old sidekick, Sir Nightai, suggested that he applied for the Class 1A watch-over job that UA offered to the third years. A chance to practice what it's like patrolling a neighborhood. You weren't just keeping an eye on the troublesome first years, but also protecting that area. It was a good experience, especially for those who never got the opportunities Mirio had been presented with. He wasn't going to sign up for exactly that reason, give others a chance. But if Sir Nightai suggests something, you do it? He had a foresight quirk, after all, not that he'd use it on trivial matters such as this. So, he signed up. All Might made sure he got assigned to Midoriya. Maybe he would have been better off around someone like Shoto Todoroki, but Mirio wasn't complaining. He'd never met Midoriya before, but from the looks of it at that many parents' evening before Class A went their separate ways for their home visits, the class utterly adored him. And when he caught Midoriya climbing out his window, insisting that he was going to Hosu, Mirio knew that this wasn't just some trivial matter. Midoriya was smart, resourceful. Mirio knew the value in predictions such as these. The alert on his phone saying that Dabi was in Hosu, almost immediately after Midoriya had suggested as such, Mirio knew he had to let Midoriya do this. All in all, it turned out pretty well. What were you thinking? Sir Nitai bellowed at him, hands slammed down on the desk. Nitai, please. He did a good job. All Might tried to interrupt. Sir simply pinched his forehead and groaned, you're as bad as each other. Reckless, stupid. You should have escorted Midoriya right back home, not gone with him. Mirio had told the two of them the whole truth behind what had happened that night, whilst they met up at the Nitai agency to discuss what had happened around Stain. He may have stretched it in front of everyone else, but he owed them so much, they deserved to know. It worked out. Mirio insisted with a smile. He didn't at all regret doing that. He'd had faith in Midoriya, and it had been well placed. It might not have, Sir hissed. You have to balance these scenarios, weigh the outcomes against each other. You were extremely lucky it played out the way it did. It was the best thing to do, Mirio insisted. Sir could be stubborn, but he wasn't going to back down either. Midoriya wasn't going to give up. And if he hadn't gone, Itza would be dead, and who knows what would have happened to Todoroki. Besides, Midoriya is very persuasive. All Might opened his mouth, likely to agree, with all points apart from the last, but Nitai pointed a warning finger at him, not a word, he snapped. All Might sheepishly kept his mouth shut. He turned back to Mirio. Midoriya has a track record of lies, manipulation, and trying to run off. Mirio shrugged, never wavering from his smile, he's not what you'd expect. I'd have to admit. He just gives people the wrong impression at first. While he spoke, Sir Nitai had leaned back into his chair with a deep sigh and was now cleaning the lenses of his glasses. To my knowledge, the boy only gives the right impression to those who have something to give him. You know what he knows. Sir gestured towards All Might, who shuffled awkwardly from foot to foot, as though embarrassed that he gave away his secret of weakness to one of the most objectively dangerous teenagers in the country. He doesn't know about One for All though, Mirio blinked. Or All for One, or he would have never pretended to have that quirk. Sir shook his head slowly whilst he put his glasses back on, the kid is quirkless. Yet, he wants to be a hero. Well, I was born quirkless, All Might admitted. Mirio perked up at that. He had no idea. I had the same dreams, he sighed, rubbing the side of his head, although I definitely didn't go about them in the same way. Midoriya is unsafe, Sir nodded. He knows too much and has the motivations to do something with that knowledge, something that could spell disaster for the likes of us. That is why he is at UA. And why you definitely shouldn't have taken him to Hosu, he said, snapping the attention back to Mirio. He was under my protection, Mirio insisted surely. He wasn't supposed to leave my sight. But I managed to find him again, and with your teachings of predictions, sir, my abilities simply outperformed his own. And all legal matters were in place, it's not like it was vigilantism, sir. All Might gave him a soft smile, I think you did an amazing. Stop, sir interrupted, stop. Don't encourage him. What am I supposed to do with the two of you? All Might, I've told you before and I'll tell you again. He stood up, straightening his jacket as he did so. You are heading towards a dangerous future. You will die an unspeakable death, and if you want to do anything you can, anything, to avoid that. Mirio could see a real fear in Sir's eyes. A real sadness, and regret. Mirio let his smile drop. All Might did too. If you want to avoid that, Sir continued, you do as I say, and the two of you stay away from that kid. Midoriya. Mirio frowned. But he's not a villain. He doesn't like All Might, but he certainly wouldn't do any harm to him. Nor do I believe he is capable. Sir Nitai's gaze flickered back to All Might's as he added, physically. The two had clearly had some sort of argument about this behind the scenes, Mirio realized. He could tell by the way the two held their gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Sir sighed, turning towards the clock on the wall as he watched time tick past. All for One and creatures with multiple quirks, he said to no one in particular. Nomu and the League of Villains. Shigaraki, and Izuku Midoriya. I don't like the direction time is taking us. Well, there's little we can do about that, sir, Mirio admitted. But I still don't think Midoriya is a real problem in all this. He's just trying to look out for himself, and his friends. I think he feels like the world is against him. We shouldn't add to that number. Sir gave him a look, not a harsh one, no, quite the opposite. Almost sympathetic, as though he was pitying Mirio for his ignorance. All villains start out small. Midoriya has started down the path. Yue can't stop him now. And the situation in Hosu was proof enough. The League of Villains isn't just after Todoroki now, they want Midoriya too. He isn't a villain, Mirio insisted, now finally standing up too. He was putting his foot down on this. He truly believed Midoriya was on their side. Even if Midoriya wasn't quite sure himself yet. He would be, when it came down to it. Right? Midoriya wasn't sure what he expected to happen in terms of him and Kiken next, but nothing at all changed for a good while. Tension hung thick in the air, the atmosphere as heavy and solemn as it had been at the very beginning of Class A. Midoriya he was ready to move on now. He'd had enough of this. Of course, he'd spoken to Mr. Aizawa on more than one occasion about changing classes, about getting away from this and starting anew, but every time he'd managed to convince him otherwise. Now, in the moments where Midoriya's mind drifted away from schoolwork, usually when he sat alone in his room, staring at the filled pages of his notebook, stuck on what else to add, he found himself thinking about the ways Mr. Aizawa had convinced him he could be a hero before. Not all of it really made sense, now he was thinking about it. Or maybe that was the problem, he was thinking about it. Mr. Aizawa simply appealed to the part of Midoriya that really wanted to be a hero, a part that still existed, no matter how hard he tried to snuff it out, it would always be there, as it always had been. If only he had a quirk, any quirk. It could have been as minor as the ability to change the color of his hair at will. Literally anything. Anything at all, and none of this would matter. He'd find some weird and wonderful way to apply that quirk to hero work, and people wouldn't target him, call him names, insist that he wasn't worth it. Midoriya would do anything for a quirk. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Midoriya was left to fantasize about having that ability he faked in front of Monoma, way back when. Stealing other quirks, wow, he'd love that. He'd been daydreaming a lot, lately. He'd often find himself irritated at interruptions to his tranquil solitude, like when Kirishima knocked on his door to spew his apologies for forcing him and Kiken to try and talk it out. Midoriya didn't mind, he knew Kirishima meant well. Besides, what Kiken had said was something Midoriya needed drilling into his brain. Other interruptions included the time when Yurika arrived to say sorry for making such a fuss about Hagakure, explaining that she was feeling rather emotional and run down after her home visit, and it all overflowed. Midoriya understood, he knew the feeling all too well. Then Aitsu would consistently turn up to insist that Midoriya came down for food, but he rarely felt like it. Yaoyorozu would do the same but was far less insistent and would give him a cup of tea and left him be, which he appreciated. Tsu would routinely arrive about half an hour later with a spare plate of food that she left on his table without a single word. Midoriya appreciated that too. Shoto was the only other one who would appear to try to talk, but he never seemed to know what to say. The week passed them by slowly and quietly by Class A standards. It really put into perspective how much of their mayhem was directly correlated with Midoriya, because now that he wasn't doing much, neither were they. Mr. Aizawa seemed to genuinely think something was wrong with them and postponed their new hero class schedule for another week in response. By the time they finally started, Midoriya had begun to feel a little better. Not in himself, particularly, only in the concept of not being a hero. He just needed to calmly trudge on through the course, enjoy learning about hero law and stuff he'd been completely invested in ever since he was a kid, and suffer through grueling training exercises that Mr. Aizawa was now putting them through in PE. In a very strange, and inhuman way, Midoriya kind of enjoyed them too, because it stopped him from thinking for once. Aitsu started his week's detention that Monday too. Midoriya thought it would mean they were both washing dishes at Class B's for an hour every evening, but Mr. Aizawa seemed to think the punishment was better served if they were separated, meaning the two alternated between helping the support course and helping Class B. Toga and May always seemed to be testing the most dangerous and explosive equipment whenever they had Aitsu on call, because he nearly always came back covered in soot and scorch marks. The only other thing of importance to note was the new addition to Class A, that being Shinso. He was quiet and secluded. He didn't talk much to anyone or care to involve himself in the drama. The only thing Midoriya had managed to learn about him was his worrying love of coffee, and his disapproval of the fact that Class A only had access to the instant stuff. Regardless, he went through more of the stuff than the rest of the class combined. But it would have been foolish of Midoriya to think that this lull would last forever. Something was bound to change. And out of all the things it could have been, of all the people who could have stood up and insisted Midoriya got his head out of the gutter, it ended up being the worst possible option. "Hey, Deku," snapped Midoriya's favorite person before he had the chance to slip upstairs for a minute before his detention with Class B. Midoriya took a deep breath and sighed. "What?" he said a little more harshly than he'd anticipated, one foot on the bottom stair and his arms wrapped around his various homework notebooks. It took him about 1 second to realize that this was an interaction that Kikin absolutely did not want to initiate and was being forced to. This realization came mainly from the fact that numerous other members of his class were now leaning over the backs of sofas and holding their breath, whilst Kirishima nudged Kikin forwards. Midoriya rolled his eyes. "What is it?" The attitude made Kikin's teeth grind together in clear frustration. "Apparently, we need to talk," he forced the words out of his mouth. Midoriya found himself sighing again, much more audible and deliberate this time. He wasn't going to be able to avoid this, was he? "Go on then," he said, walking back over to the common room and dropping his books down on the corner of the closest table. There was silence for a few moments too many. Kikin looked to Kirishima for a moment, who just grinned and nodded in encouragement. Kikin tooted and turned back to Midoriya. "Apparently," he said with even more sarcasm, "I need to say sorry." Midoriya wasn't even amused. "I didn't know that word was in your vocabulary." Kikin's fists shook with rage. "Not that it matters," Midoriya continued, cocking his head to one side, "there's nothing to apologize for." "Exactly." Kikin exploded, figuratively, important to add, and turned back to the others. "I have nothing to freaking apologize for, so shut the hell up." This was a terrible idea. Jiro perked up from the other side of the room. "Look at that," Midoriya droned, "we actually agree on something. Can I leave now?" Kirishima grasped Kikin's shoulders and turned him back around to face Midoriya. "You're clearly upset," he smiled genuinely, "so, Bakugo would like to say sorry." "Well, there's nothing to be sorry for," Midoriya yelled. The act even surprised himself. Everyone blinked at him as though to wonder if this was actually Midoriya speaking, or some alien imposter. There was silence for a moment more. "He said you can't be a hero," said Shoto. Midoriya turned around to see him standing behind him. So that was wrong." Midoriya gave him a look that only he would know how to decipher. "Because I'm a villain and you're just the quirkless kid pretending that he can be a hero." "It was wrong," Shoto repeated. Midoriya blinked furiously and reached for his notebooks to leave, not wanting to participate in this anymore. Shoto realized and darted ahead to take them out of his reach. "Let me leave," Midoriya said a lot more pathetically than he might have hoped. "No," he said with a hint of concern. "Why, you can be a hero." "Shut up," Midoriya hissed in a tone not too dissimilar to Kikin's own. "I can't." He yanked his notebooks out his friend's grasp and tried to walk away. "Huh?" Midoriya turned to see Kikin look at him strangely, his arms crossed, and brow furrowed. "All these freaking years and now you listen to me? What the actual hell? Leave me alone." "No, what the hell?" Kikin exclaimed, marching closer. "All these years and now we're this freaking close to a hero course examination, and I get it through your thick skull. Well, no need to rub it in." But he carried on anyway, almost laughing. "Go on then. Say that I'm freaking right." Midoriya stormed up to him to look the taller boy in the eye, tears pricking at his own. "You were right." Bakugo Kirishima tried to interrupt. Kikin prodded Midoriya in the chest, causing him to stumble backwards a little. "You can't be a hero." "Maybe I can't." "Not freaking maybe. I can't. I can't be a freaking hero. And I'm not going to be. Happy now?" "Huh. Yeah, I'm freaking happy." "Good. Good." Midoriya turned around, slammed his notebooks into Shoto's chest, and whilst ignoring the pleas of his friends and classmates, pulled on his shoes. Moments later, he slammed the front door behind him and marched the short distance to the Class B dorm building for detention. Shoto dropped the notebooks to the floor. Seconds later he had Bakugo's collar in his right hand, ice already creeping across the latter's shirt, and his left fist smoldering, ready to punch his lights out. It helped that Shoto was a few centimeters taller than him. There was a sudden commotion in which the likes of Kirishima and Sato tried to pull the two apart, but Bakugo merely laughed and waved the two of them off. "Bring it on, half and half," he sneered. "I'll take any of you on. How dare you talk to Midoriya like that?" Shoto said in barely a whisper. "Well, someone's gotta do it." Bakugo growled, slapping Shoto's hand away and brushing the ice from his front. "You're freaking welcome. Midoriya is more of a hero than any of us." Shoto retorted, rapidly raising his voice. "It doesn't matter how he freaking acts, it's about what he can and can't do. And he can't be a bloody hero. He can. More than you," he snarled, looking him up and down. Bakugo prodded him in the chest as he had with Midoriya, but Shoto didn't stumble backwards. Deku doesn't have a quirk. Like it or not, he needs a power to be a stupid hero. It's the basic freaking requirement. It's like wanting to be a lifeguard without being able to swim, or a singer whilst being mute. It's not going to happen. Bakugo, Kirishima finally stepped between the two of them. Shoto stepped back and onto Midoriya work. He sighed and stooped down to gather it up, soon joined by Tsu, who was doing the same. "Bakugo, man, that wasn't on." "What do you freaking mean, that wasn't on?" "Huh?" Bakugo repeated with a sneer. "I'm right. That doesn't matter," Kirishima sighed. "Please man, you have to give him a chance. It doesn't work like that. Midoriya is different. Yeah, as in he's bloody useless. He can't be a hero. You don't know that, man." "I do know that, you know that, we all freaking know that." "Bakugo." Shoto stood up beside Tsu, blinking at Kirishima. He didn't think he'd ever heard him raise his voice before. Even Bakugo seemed taken aback. Kirishima sighed, "You can't be a hero. You just can't." Bakugo blinked at him. He let out a couple of huffs of laughter. "Yes, I can." "No," Kirishima said, shaking his head, "Man, you can't. Not like this." He clearly didn't know what to say for a moment. Glancing around, Shoto saw Bakugo's eyes drift from classmate to classmate, each avoiding his gaze. He turned back to Kirishima with a growl, "You don't know the first thing about what it takes to be a freaking hero." Slowly and calmly, Kirishima pushed down the finger that Bakugo pointed at him accusingly. "Do you?" Silence. Shinso slurped his coffee in the corner. Everyone stared at him. "What?" Bakugo pushed Kirishima harshly out the way. He made sure to knock shoulders with Shoto as he passed, causing him to drop the books and paper he'd collected up again. As he stormed upstairs and out of sight, Kirishima sighed and bent down to collect the papers for Shoto. He handed them back. "I'm sorry, this is my fault." "It's not your fault, Ribbit," said Tsu, passing the rest of the paper to Shoto. "That's all Bakugo's doing. Maybe Midoriya should have gotten him expelled when he had the chance." Siro perked up. Shoto agreed. Kirishima's sigh didn't seem to suggest an alignment either way. "Look, I don't know the history behind those two," said Shinso, "but it looks like that altercation has had a long time coming. Not anyone's fault in particular." "You have no idea, man," Kirishima groaned, running his hands down his face. "I really don't. I have no idea what half your names are. I just hope Deku's okay," Yurika mumbled from the sofa where she sat with Hagakure. "He doesn't like that name," Shoto snapped. Sorry. I'll stop using it." Shoto turned to the window facing the Class B building, vaguely catching the silhouettes of their sister class. Midoriya had done so much for him. Was there anything at all he could do in return? So, Monoma was in a bit of a predicament. "Guys," he whispered to his classmates in the common room. "What?" replied Setsuna, her mouth full of biscuits. "Where's Honuki?" he grimaced, glancing around for the boy in question. "Shower," Sen replied simply. "Why?" asked Pony curiously. Monoma hesitantly pointed back to the kitchen. "I think Class A Wonder Boy's upset." "What?" Midoriya, blinked Kendo, standing up. Monoma nodded, a little nervous to glance back into the kitchen area and check on him. "Well, go and ask if he's okay," Kendo insisted as she walked over. "What?" Monoma said a little too loudly. He lowered his voice again. "Anyone but me. He hates me." Kendo rolled her eyes. "He doesn't hate you. He threatened to stab me at the sports festival." "That never happened," Sen retorted. He had a sword at my neck. Different thing. The point stands. Just go talk to him, Kendo sighed, turning him around and starting to push him towards the kitchen where 18 was supposed to be cleaning their dishes. Monoma dug his heels into the ground in a futile attempt to resist. Please someone get Honmuki, or you do it. You're class president. He knows you better, Kendo insisted. They were almost there now. But. Go. And she pushed him into the kitchen. He stumbled and only just managed to not trip over. He whirled around to give Kendo a look, but she'd already disappeared around the corner and out of sight. Unsurely, Monoma turned around and expected to find 18 staring right back at him with that angry green glare of his. Instead, he hadn't seemed to have acknowledged his presence at all. 18 sat in exactly the same position that Monoma had found him in the first time, sunk to the floor under the sink, hugging his knees and burying his face, his shoulders silently shaking. Monoma sighed. Hello, he said cautiously as he approached. He noted how 18's shoulders stiffened, but he made no move to tell him to leave him alone or anything, so Monoma ended up sinking down against the cabinets beside him. Now sitting on the kitchen floor, he tried again. Are you alright? 18 sniffed. He finally looked up, revealing a tear-stricken face and reddened eyes. He wiped them with the back of his sleeve and didn't meet Monoma's eyes. Monoma blinked. He didn't know what he had expected, and it was probably this, to be honest, but he didn't exactly know what to do about it. What's going on? Monoma attempted. 18 said nothing and just tilted his head further away, staring blankly at the wall on the other side of him to Monoma. He was so terrible at this, so terrible. But if Monoma wanted to be an actual hero, he had to get better. He had to start somewhere. Something to do with Class A, right? Monoma guessed. He couldn't see why, since Class A had all been as thick as thieves, probably not the best simile, but regardless, they'd all gotten along well since the beginning of the year. What could have possibly changed so quickly? But 18 still wasn't cooperating in any way, shape or form, and was still silently crying, curled in on himself again. It was weird, because Monoma had never seen him in this state. 18 had always appeared tough, frightening, and in complete control of himself and everyone and everything around him, despite his quirklessness. Gosh, it was so weird that he was quirkless. Monoma could never have guessed. But seeing him like this suddenly put it all into perspective. Midoriya wasn't unbreakable, or some horrible villain to defeat. Right now, he just looked like someone who needed help. Monoma wasn't sure if he was the right person to deliver that. I'm sorry about what I said at the sports festival, Monoma said anyway. Midoriya actually looked up at that, finally looking at him. He hadn't really meant his apology as much as he should have had, back at the sports festival, when it all kicked off and 18 ended up pointing a sword at him. Look, I don't know what's going on or why you're so upset. But I guess I can at least settle that. So, congratulations on getting third, I guess. Midoriya rubbed the tears from his eyes again. Thanks, he stammered. And, when did we last speak? He sniffed. Probably when we last did an escape attempt. Oh yeah, and you fell in Honmuki's quicksand trap twice. Monoma barked in laughter. He quickly caught himself and cleared his throat. I mean, yeah, then. But Midoriya gave him a slight smile. That was kind of funny. Monoma let out a huff of laughter, leaning back so his head hit the cabinet behind him. 2-0 to us. But we won the sports festival. Monoma pouted. Yeah, whatever. Also, didn't Uraraka tackle you to the ground last escape attempt and you weren't able to do anything to stop her? Moving on. Midoriya snorted. Moving on. Yeah, why are you upset? He sighed, rubbing at his eyes again. It's a long story. Monoma glanced up at the clock on the wall. Well, you have 50 minutes of detention left. And so he told him about how he and Bakugo, or Kiken, as he called him, had grown up together, and how Bakugo got his quirk and Midoriya never did. About how, despite all this, Midoriya had dreamed of being a hero all his life, no matter how many people tried to tell him it was impossible or give him this pitiful look as if they knew right from the start that his dreams were doomed to fail. He explained how Bakugo's merciless taunts built up, how they got worse and worse until, finally, he snapped. The manic smile Monoma knew so well rose back up again as Midoriya explained how he did it, how he got Bakugo into Class A. The security cameras, his hacking and piling evidence, how he walked into a police station one day, dropping his papers and notebooks on the front desk and proclaiming that he was here to file a complaint, and in excruciating detail, the look on the officer's face as they combed through the files Midoriya provided, and how piece by piece, he brought down the entire school, and sent Bakugo to UA, to the wrong class, 1A. Then, Midoriya explained how Bakugo was attacked by a villain made of sludge, and how the heroes on the scene were going to let him die. How he stepped in instead, and in a fit of rage, shouted and screamed at anyone who would listen about the incompetency of the heroes. And all that led up to what went on behind the scenes at UA, stuff he'd never even admitted to his closest friends. About how Bakugo had hit him more than once, and how he laughed in his face at the realization that no, Midoriya could never be a hero, not without a quirk. And I just don't know what to do anymore, he finished, hands over his eyes. You really, honestly want to be a hero? Monoma asked, just to doubly make sure. Even Midoriya seemed a bit confused, reaffirmed by the way he shrugged and stared at the ceiling. I feel like everyone who says that I can be a hero at this point are only saying it to make me feel better, or out of pity. They don't actually believe it. His speech was muffled by his hands. Monoma sighed, you know, we're not actually too different. I've been thinking about what you said, back at the sports festival. You probably don't even remember, but it's kind of been ringing in my head for a while. Is this when I pointed a sword at you? Might have been. Anyway, you said something about thinking about why I was really here, why I wanted to be a hero and all that. And I think I initially signed up because I wanted to prove that I was something, you know? It's hard, with my quirk. Because, well, it's never really mine. I have to copy someone else's. In a way, I'm kind of quirkless. Midoriya scoffed. Well, it's true. Yeah, I get where you're coming from. So, we're the same. Just agree with me. Okay. And because I don't really have a quirk, I've had a lot of people say that I can't be a hero either, because it would be too difficult. And I got lucky on the entrance exam day because there were enough people with powerful quirks around for me to exploit, alright? And most of them weren't using their powers in the right way to get the points they needed. People can be so stupid with their powers, Midoriya mumbled. Right? I can always use them so much better than he caught the look on Midoriya's face and stopped his train of thought. He cleared his throat again, alright, yes, so, I was lucky. And I guess I, like everyone else, was rather caught up in the idea that there was one villain class and one hero class, and we were supposed to be against each other. And, you're supposed to be the leader of the villains, so. Midoriya smiled softly, I get it. You do, because Monoma wasn't even sure what he was talking about at this point. Yeah. Well. That's that then. Hey, where did you learn to sword fight? Yayorozu. Just, Class A. Yeah. Wait, so you just picked it up at school last term and that's it? He grinned and nodded. But you're so good at it? He smiled a little wider, I wouldn't say that. Is it like with hacking? You just pick stuff up easily? Maybe. I don't really know. Those are the only two things. You should try some more hero-like stuff, Monoma nodded to himself, like parkour or martial arts. I'd bet you'd be good at that too. He seemed unsure, but as though he appreciated the thought, thanks, Monoma. You know, you're a lot nicer when you're not so riled up over something. I have no idea what you're talking about. Yes, you do, you were completely obsessed with the idea that we were up to something back at our first escape attempt and got yourself into trouble because of it. But I was right. He gave him a look and pointed to his cheek, I am permanently scarred. Oh. Whoops. Whoops. Midoriya laughed in disbelief. What else do you expect me to say? Sorry. Well, sorry. He just laughed again, as though he didn't really care. That's good because Monoma really didn't know what he could do about that one. Whoops. Suddenly, Midoriya stood up, I should probably go. Monoma blinked at the clock, oh, it's been an hour already. Midoriya nodded as he pulled his blazer back on. He must have tossed it aside whilst he washed the dishes. Monoma was about to make some excuse about him not being able to leave until they were all finished, but soon found that they already were. He must have done them all very quickly. "Hey, wait." Monoma called after him, before he could reach the front door. "Is it you or four who's coming tomorrow?" "Itza." Monoma was painstakingly aware that the rest of his class were staring and grinning at him from across the room. "Can you make him go to support instead?" Midoriya smiled, "Sure. See you tomorrow." And he closed the door behind him. "Ah," Setsuna gave him a toothy smile, "Monoma made a friend." "It was a truce," Monoma retorted. "I told you Midoriya's nice." Honuki, who had since emerged from his shower, shook his head in disbelief at how long this had taken them all to figure out. "Why didn't you come and help me?" Monoma pointed at him accusingly. "Midoriya actually likes you." "He's calling him Midoriya instead of 18 and everything," Setsuna whispered rather loudly to Kendo, "they're totally friends. Would you cut it out?" "You guys were actually having a nice conversation," Honuki shrugged. "It's not that bad to be friends with Class A." "Yeah, don't be embarrassed, Monoma," Setsuna tried not to laugh. "Shut up. Okay, line up." It had been a while since Aizawa had taught a hero class. He'd gotten used to the way the infamous Class 1A worked, the patterns that those lost teenagers displayed in their behavior, those which could be carried over from one situation to the next. But although all the kids of his current class held those same issues, same patterns, the group was different. And there was only one factor he could think of, the only difference from years before. Quirkless Izuku Midoriya. Speaking of which, "Where's 18?" he asked the class standing before him. There was a sizable gap between Yayorozu, student number 20, and Bakugo, number 17. "Detention, sir," Itza dutifully responded, ever keen to prove himself after being demoted from class vice president. Aizawa frowned. Midoriya's detention should have finished an hour ago. That was why Itza was able to be here, since the two had detention at the same time. Regardless, it wasn't compulsory for them to be here. This was an extracurricular activity, of sorts, hero practice, extra PE lessons, whatever they wanted to call them. Getting into the provisional licensing exam was one thing, passing it was another. It was notoriously difficult, and many hero courses elect to only send in second years. First years risk failing and lowering the school's national placement. UA could afford to take the hit, and first years more often than not pass the exam with flying colors, considering the challenging entrance exams they needed to pass in the first place. UA would then enter a second group of hero students half a year later, for all those who failed and those who transferred into the course since. Class 1A was an entirely different situation. They'd had none of the training Class 1B had experienced, and would be competing with hundreds of other, well-versed hero students from across the country. Rumor has it, the licensing exam was going to be even tighter than usual this year, only giving those precious licenses to a handful of examines. Class 1A has what it takes, Aizawa was sure of it. The class was unusually talented. Most, if not all, of those with dangerous quirks now had a solid enough grip on their powers for graduation, and the rest were hard-working, enthusiastic, and driven. It was all thanks to Midoriya, of course, the reason that they were all happy to pursue this path of heroism. It had taken some convincing, and some difficult steps along the way, some more recent than others, but Aizawa was now confident that none of them felt forced to do this. They wanted to, and that was good enough. Strangely enough, the only one who still seemed uncertain, was Midoriya himself. Aizawa ordered them all to take laps around the track as the light began to dim. He stood in the middle and observed silently, thinking. Midoriya was likely with Toga and her friend, right? Aizawa couldn't see why he'd want to spend a second more than necessary with Class B. The only other person who was missing was Shinso, which was also a little concerning. Aizawa wasn't even sure if the kid knew about Class A's plan to get into the licensing exam, not great considering he also was within a shot. He'd expected Midoriya to explain, and for that to be who Shinso grew close to. The two had a lot in common. There was the small chance, of course, that the two were together, since they were both not here. But it was unlikely. Shinso was probably sitting in his room, having no idea where the rest of his new class was. Not good. Something had definitely happened, and it had happened to Midoriya. Aizawa sighed. Might as well focus on the rest of them for now, let them distract themselves from whatever teenage drama they'd cooked up for a while. After their lapse, Aizawa had constructed a simple activity, just to test something. Something specific to the fact that Midoriya was missing. "Here's what we're going to do," he began once they'd lined up again. "Remember, capture the flag. We'll be simplifying that down to one objective." Aizawa pulled from his pocket a piece of red cloth. 20, come forward." She did just that, confused. "Yaoyorozu and I will be standing here, in the middle of the track. I will be holding this flag, and 20 will be stopping your advancements the best she can. Defense only, no attacking. Your objective is to get the flag off me. You just have to take it out of my grasp. That's it. Step outside the track and think up a plan. You can start whenever you want after that." Already exchanging murmurs of ideas, the remaining 17 students hurried to the outside of the running track. Mr. Aizawa." Yaoyorozu spoke up after a moment of silence. Why am I the one defending?" she blinked curiously. "Because you're vice president." "Oh. And I think it would be good practice for you and your quirk. Strategy and quick thinking will be a vital skill for you. Have confidence. I would have given you a partner for aid if I didn't think you were capable of holding them off for long enough for me to see what I need to see." Yaoyorozu smiled softly at the compliment, but this quickly morphed into a frown. "What are you looking for?" Aizawa grinned. "Teamwork." The first attack came quickly. With a yell and confused shouts from his classmates, Bakugo raced forwards, powered by his explosions. Aizawa let his eyes flash red. The boy fell to the ground but was undeterred, continuing on his charge. It wasn't long before Yaoyorozu was holding the infamous net gun sheet utilized in the sports festival, against Ashido. Bakugo dodged one but not the other, and with Aizawa's gaze locked on him, he had no way of escaping. 17, you're out, Aizawa announced. "What?" he yelled, struggling against the net. "If you were part of a hero team and we were villains holding a hostage or any valuable, you have just been disarmed and immobilized. You're dead. You didn't tell us that was part of the freaking game," he snapped in frustration, as Yaoyorozu wandered over and started to drag Bakugo out of the ring the running track provided. "You should never expect that you are capable of taking on a villain alone," Aizawa replied calmly, but loud enough so that the rest of the class could hear. "And you cannot expect that an opponent will follow the same rules and morals as yourself. There are few hero teams out there, and most work alone, mainly because of the money and payload. But whether or not you stick together once you become heroes, you will be expected to team up on the regular, possibly with people you don't know. Therefore, quick thinking and teamwork is the only option in modern-day heroics. 17. Stop thinking that you're good enough to go alone, it doesn't matter if you are. You work in a team regardless." Bakugo had burnt the net off himself whilst Aizawa was speaking, since his gaze was finally averted. Yaoyorozu had made a sword and shield and stood ready before Aizawa. He had yet to figure out why she was so. She kicked at mid-air, hit something solid, picked up the net launcher and caught an invisible mass before them. "Same goes for you, 16, Aizawa sighed at Hagakure. The standalone villains of the group were also going to face this trouble. He half expected Yurika to try the same, but she had grown well in her time at UA, keen to work with her friends. But it wasn't just Bakugo and Hagakure who peeled off. After what seemed to be about a minute of talking, Mina, Shiro, Kaminari, and a few others turned away from Aiza, who was seemingly trying to organize them all, and spread out across the pitch, not really talking much, but at least more ready than the other two had been. Regardless, without support items, quite a few of them could do nothing useful, evident from the fact that Kaminari quickly knocked both him and Shiro out of the game when he tried and failed to send a stream of electricity towards Yaoyorozu using Shiro's tape. Mina at least got somewhere, melting Yaoyorozu's nets and shield, but with Aizawa's quirk erasing ability, she didn't get far before she too, alongside Kirishima and Sato, who had stepped in to protect them, were sitting outside with Bakugo and Hagakure. Aizawa would have liked to say that the rest of the class formulated a reasonable plan of attack, but after about 20 minutes, the only ones who remained were, strangely enough, Midoriya's close friends. Aiza, Yurika, Azui, and Shoto stayed outside the ring. Aiza looked a little panicked. He'd been trying and failing to get everyone to listen to him this entire time, although Aizawa couldn't quite hear what they were saying. After a minute more, Azui took charge. Their method was something along the lines of what Aizawa was expecting to begin with. Shoto charged forwards first. With his ice and fire, he created steam, obscuring the pitch, and numerous pillars of ice for shelter and stealth. Very smart, Aizawa let him do it. He could see Uraraka jump from pillar to pillar, closely followed by Azui. In silence, the four spread out across the pitch, and Aizawa unraveled his scarf with a grin. Aiza charged first. Yayorozu tried to send forth a net but missed in his burst of speed. Aizawa caught him in his capture weapon, however, before his hands could reach the red flag hanging out of his pocket. Now occupied, he could do little when Shoto reappeared, sending a wave of fire at Yayorozu, who was forced to protect herself. The two engaged in combat at the same time that Uraraka dropped from the sky. Her abilities in martial arts were more than impressive. She could maneuver unlike any other, few could match her skill, but Aizawa was one of them. He was evading her advancements whilst also ensuring Aiza stayed put, trying to add her to his net of fabric in the meantime. He could have done it, as well, if it weren't for Azui's arrival at the last minute, wrapping her tongue around his arms to give Uraraka the opening she needed to grab the flag and wave it around her head enthusiastically, cheering and bouncing up and down. Well done, Aizawa sighed, releasing Aiza as Shoto's steam cover began to settle around them. Look. I got it. I got it. Uraraka cried to the rest of the class as they hurried over, clapping and shouting. Well planned and well executed, Aizawa praised. Azui, good initiative and leadership. I will tell Principal Nizu that you can take part in the licensing exam. The same goes for Yayorozu. Uraraka seemed even more excited than them at the prospect. Aizawa just wanted a little more time before he confirmed her. She was one of the more dangerous as a villain, after all. The rest of you were disorganized and out of line, Aizawa said, their grins quickly fading. Aiza did the right thing, stepping in for a leadership role, but none of you were willing to listen, which made him unsure and unable to lead. Aiza, you need to be stronger with your words, be sure of yourself. Yes, sir, he nodded glumly. Imagine this was a hostage situation, Aizawa continued, referring back to his earlier explanation. Time and pride is not something you can afford to sacrifice here. It doesn't matter who's in charge, and none of you can expect that it will always be you. You have to be willing to listen, and you have to be willing to lead. You should be able to work alone, but more importantly, able to work together. You seem to be able to do that when you were trying to escape UA. Why couldn't you do it now? Silence. Anyone? Aizawa blinked at them expectantly. You know the answer. Kirishima was the one to speak up. Midori is not here. Correct. We don't freaking need him, Bakugo mumbled. Are you sure? Yes, I'm freaking sure, he yelled. Anyone could have been the bloody leader, you just didn't tell us we'd be out if we got caught. You had more than enough people on your side to never have needed to get caught. Even if you were organized enough to attack all at once, you would have been within a shot. But the exercise caught you off guard, and you were unable to strategize quickly enough. Bakugo opened his mouth to retaliate again, but Aizawa was quicker. We'll be repeating this exercise now. This time, the team that was successful will be helping Yayorozu and me. But sir, started Ajiro. I'd get planning if I were you. They were a little better, Aizawa had to admit. Bakugo took the lead, and it was clear he wasn't stupid when it came to battle strategy, he knew what he was doing. But Bakugo was abrasive, loud, and rude. Not everyone remaining in that group was keen to follow his lead. Yes, they were successful, but it was nowhere near as clean and quick as it could have been. The answer was clear, and they all knew it. They'd done so well so far because of Midoriya's lead. Would they have done so well in the sports festival without him? No. It wasn't just them letting Midoriya to the finals, it was him getting them all through. So, what to do about Midoriya himself? We've been here before, Mr. Aizawa began. It had been a while since Midoriya fell out with Class A. They were quiet around him, unsure. They ate lunch together, but it just felt awkward. Like they didn't know what to say. Probably because they didn't. There wasn't anything they could do to make Midoriya feel better, he knew that. He supposed Mr. Aizawa would see eventually that something was up. Him asking for a chat after class was hardly unexpected. Yep, Midoriya replied, tapping his feet against the floor under his chair. They sat in their classroom, empty apart from the two of them. Midoriya was at his desk, and Mr. Aizawa had pulled Kiken's chair around to face him. What happened? he insisted. How exactly was he supposed to go about explaining this? Did he want to at all? No. But it looked like he was going to have to. Mr. Aizawa acted like a doting parent, even if he tried to pretend otherwise. And to think he was kind of scared of him at the beginning of UA. I had an argument with Kaken, he admitted with a shrug. It's not like it's an uncommon occurrence. Aizawa sighed deeply. What did he say to make you upset? Midoriya laughed slightly. I'm not mad at him, I don't want him to get in trouble. Midoriya, you never want Bakugo to get in trouble. Frankly, it's concerning. If I didn't know any better, I'd think you'd consider him as a good friend, the way you always stand up for him. What? Midoriya exclaimed, jolting upright in his seat. He is not my friend, he snarled. I want him to have a real chance at being a hero. Why? He said in his low, gravely voice. There was a hint of anger in it. Because. I don't know. I just do. Is it because he never gave you one? What? A chance? Do you give him a chance because he never gave you one? Midoriya blinked. He'd never really thought about it that way before. And no, he has a powerful quirk, he could use it to save a lot of lives. It would be selfish of me to stop him from doing that, he insisted, crossed his arms and averting his gaze from his teachers. And I thought we decided that powerful quirks aren't what make a good hero. Midoriya rolled his eyes. He'd had just about enough of this. Look, I get it, alright? You can stop the act, quirks are everything in this world. And I don't have that everything, so I don't get anything. Aizawa didn't flinch in his expression, so, he convinced you that you can't be a hero again, huh? Midoriya stood up. He wasn't dealing with this today. Someone had to do it, he said as he picked up his bag and tried to leave. Sit down, Midoriya, Aizawa called out, not moving an inch. Midoriya got halfway across the classroom before he stopped, pulled a face and walked back over, slumping into his chair once more. Why can't you be a hero? He asked that same damn stupid question. I just can't. Okay. Midoriya found himself yelling. I can't. I don't have a quirk. The whole reason we have heroes in the first place is so that they can fight fire with fire, quirks with quirks. And I don't have a quirk. So, by definition, I can't be a hero. So, does that mean I can't be a hero either? Mr. Aizawa queried, raising an eyebrow. Midoriya stood up, his chair sliding backwards and hitting the front of Shinso's empty desk. He slammed his hands down on the table. It's not the same, he cried. It's not the freaking same. You can level the playing field. I can't. I don't have anything. You have more than you realize, he replied, not at all bothered by Midoriya's outburst. He swallowed the lump in his throat, growing in his frustration. What? Just, exactly, what do I have that could match up to Kaken, to Shoto or Uraraka or Momo or Aitsa or any of them? I couldn't beat them in a fight. The sports festival suggests otherwise. It was a fluke, he insisted as he flopped back down into his seat. And she could have, I know she could have taken me down. But she didn't. What? Because she pitted me? Because she knew that I needed to win for us to fulfill Nizu's challenge. It doesn't count. Mr. Aizawa simply said. Midoriya felt like crying. Just breaking down, right there. He wanted to go home. Do you think Nizu could beat any of your classmates in a fight? Midoriya blinked, hating how his voice cracked when he said, what? I don't think he would either, he nodded, brushing his dark, greasy hair from his eyes. But you know, he does have a pro hero license. Midoriya sniffed and rubbed at his eyes before any tears could leak out of them. Why yeah, but he's Nizu. The corner of Mr. Aizawa's lip curled upwards for a moment, and you're Midoriya. He sniffed again and with utter disappointment in himself, realized that he really was crying. Tears pouring down his face, Midoriya rested his head down on the table and covered it with his arms, sobbing hysterically, shoulders shaking. Mr. Aizawa said nothing for a while, just sat there. Then, Midoriya heard the chair squeak against the floor as it was dragged around to his side of the table. He felt a hand on his shoulder, kind and gentle. Honestly, just that simple gesture meant the world. They sat there for who knows how long. Eventually, Midoriya lifted his head, eyes all red and puffy. He wiped away the water from his vision and gave a glum smile to Mr. Aizawa. I am sorry, he almost whispered. Mr. Aizawa didn't say anything in response, just took his hand away and gave him a soft smile in response. Hey, he could actually smile nicely. I really do think you can be a hero, he insisted after a moment longer. Midoriya shook his head, too tired to cry anymore. No. And no, I've had enough. I can't. I just can't. So, is it really your lack of a quirk, or is it the people, holding you back? I don't know, both. I think it's only one. Midoriya let out a chuff of sad laughter, the quirk thing. No, the people. You let them get to your head. It's really, really hard for them to not to. He nodded, I know. But what do they know, really? What I know, is that you have real potential. And I don't give people hope if they don't deserve it, if they don't really have a chance. Because you do. I do. Another nod, sure, confident. Not just anyone can face one of the most dangerous serial killers in the country, if not the most, and come out with nothing but a scratch and a few bruises. Your classmates didn't manage that. But you did. Midoriya let out another laugh. Less sad, this time. He did do that, didn't he? But, either way. If I became a real hero. I couldn't do much, Midoriya acknowledged. Well, you couldn't fight the biggest, toughest villains, Mr. Aizawa admitted. At least, not alone. There was something in the way he said that. Midoriya frowned, what do you mean? He sighed, glancing around the classroom for a bit. He gestured towards the empty chairs. Your classmates need you. You've been missing from the after-school hero training sessions. Your absence is felt. Was he talking about leadership? Well, can't Yaoyorozu or Aitsu take charge? I don't think it's quite the same as you, he said as though he was genuinely curious about it. I think that, the fact that you're quirkless, makes them respect you. Respect, it's very important. It's how I choose class presidents every year, I wait for the class to. It's no accident that you came out on top. You're a natural-born leader. Every single one of your classmates takes your word, your judgment, to heart. You convinced them to be vigilantes, and they were going to do it, as long as you were there to lead them. Now, you've convinced them to be heroes. But they're going to fall apart if you don't lead that charge too. It was obvious that he was being completely honest. Midoriya just stared at him, unsure of what to say, or what to think. Mr. Aizawa just continued, yeah, you wouldn't be like any ordinary hero. But you would be capable of working alike to me. Underground heroics may not be the dream of many, but you save lives. Maybe not from falling buildings, but that's not quite your style anyway, or mine. And it's not just that. Something that heroics today is really missing, are real, put-together hero teams. I'm not going to pretend, I know you know about All Might's weakness. Midoriya stiffened for a moment, although, that should have been obvious. At the rate he's going, soon enough, the man's going to have to retire, Mr. Aizawa sighed. That was so weird. All Might had been number one for as long as Midoriya could remember. Of course, the guy wasn't immortal, he'd have to step down eventually. He supposed he'd never really thought about it before. All Might is the symbol of peace, said Mr. Aizawa in a mocking kind of tone. The problem with that is, once he's gone, he'll leave a power void in his place. It's looking like Endeavor will take number one afterwards, but I think we both know that just won't cut it. He gave Midoriya a look. He knew something was up. But that wasn't Midoriya's secret to spill, not yet. Realizing he was going to say nothing, Mr. Aizawa carried on, having individual people with so much on their shoulders is unstable, literally and metaphorically. We need change, and hero teams are what is going to fill that gap. It makes the most sense. And I have never seen a class like yours. If you can hold them together, if you can pass the licensing exam together, if you can graduate and stay together, the lot of you can rise to the top. And I mean the very top. Your quirks and abilities are diverse and already well formed from your times as villains and vigilantes. You cover all areas. And when you, and only when you, are the leader, in control, your teamwork is impeccable. Midoriya, you are the only person who can do this. You could change the face of heroics forever. Midoriya was gaping at him, drinking in every word of praise and reigniting that mischievous spark in his eyes. And suddenly, he could see it. It had always been so obvious, but he'd been so blind. Because no, he couldn't be a hero on his own, not in the way that he'd always wanted. But, who says he would be alone? And it wasn't just that, it wasn't just those words that changed it. It was the thought of how, just imagine the Class 1A graduates, a team of heroes. Imagine how that would look to the likes of a younger Yurika, or Shoto, or Tsu, like Tsu's little brother? Or people stuck in the horrible situations described across his class. And who better to be at the head of such a team, such a vision, than someone who didn't have a quirk at all? In that moment, he thought back to the first time Mr. Aizawa had ever used his name, not 18. His name. It was the day he'd pretended to have a quirk in front of Monoma. And he'd said, "There is power in powerlessness," Midoriya whispered, eyes wide. Mr. Aizawa nodded. Midoriya hadn't even realized he'd said that out loud. He looked down at his hands. Empty, plain, boring hands. They had no special ability, no uniqueness to them, just like the rest of him. He clenched them into fists and smiled. There is power in powerlessness. Alright, that's where we'll leave off for the day. Thanks so much for listening along with me today. If you enjoyed, please like and comment down below. It really helps with the algorithms. I look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao for now, lovelies.